So I'm going to do something a little bit different to Dom. So my bit would be rubbish, wouldn't it? Although I am going to touch on some of the language stuff that you talked about. So I did this talk actually at Nordev Con early this year, and I've tried to condense it down a little bit because it was 40 minutes, but we'll see how we go. So my background is in more front-end development, but I started in a sort of what was user experience. It wasn't really called that at the time, but it was a user experience team. So my background is more in front-end development, design strategy, and psychology. So I've done lots of research over the years into particularly the way that people behave with technology. And I had a debate with my team a couple of months ago about the use of the term guys. So lots of people seem to think that the word guys is a very collective term. It's just sort of a colloquialism for you lot. Whereas a lot of other people seem to think that actually it's specifically guys is for male, men, it's a group of men. And they're very adamant about that. So I had this debate with my team a couple of months ago. So my team looks like that. We're actually a team of 5 now, and we now have another female that's joined the team as well. So I'm very much outnumbered. Which is quite unusual actually for a digital team, as I'm sure you're probably already aware. If you work in techie teams, that's quite unusual. Anyway, I'm a bloke who's quite used to using the word guys as that colloquialism for you lot, particularly at events where you're talking to a big group of people. It is kind of a nicer, less formal way of just saying everybody. And when I asked the team, actually they said, yeah, on balance, guys is fine. Like, we use the term guys to mean a collective group of people. So I turned to Google, and Google says that's not just people. That's very much male. I've also likely completely thrown the Google search algorithm into my sexual preferences, but that's for another talk. And here are the first 2 results on actual Google. Clearly this isn't much help, because the first one says persons of either sex, and the second one, which is Merriam-Webster, which is man or fellow. So that hasn't really helped. So I've kind of had to make my own mind up on this one, and I'm going to explain a little bit about how I've made up my mind on this. So we're going to have a look at how culture shapes our language, and in turn we're going to have a look at how language shapes our attitudes and our culture, and whether it can be used to be effectively, essentially, change our behaviours. Yep.
After conversations that we had, I had the guys' conversation with my team, and they objected to it.
Interesting.
So in my team, I have one lady and I have one non-binary, and yeah, they didn't like it.
As in the word guys?
As in the word, it being referred to as the word guy.
Interesting. Well, there you go. And again, I think we can talk about it afterwards, because I think it is still it's an area that's open, ripe for discussion. So I'm also going to talk about how we can take stock of other language that we use as well, try to communicate better with our teams, and see if we can use language to actually attract a more diverse range of people into our industry as a whole, and more perspective into our teams. And you might agree with me, you might not agree, and that's totally okay, but we'll get to that a bit later on. So the first thing to look at is how culture actually shapes our language. And it really, really does. The words we use evolve over many centuries of use, but it's generally created by the way that our culture works, and the way that we behave within our societies actually generates our language. So here's a really nice example of that. So this is one of the Sami people. So if you've ever been to Lapland, you might have seen someone like this. They live in the northern reaches of most of Scandinavia and Russia. And they've lived for centuries amongst reindeer. So the tradition of rearing and herring reindeer is very closely protected, particularly in Lapland. And you can only do it if you're actually born into a family of herders like this. There are about 10 Sami languages still left, all of which are endangered. There's only a few that are really practiced on any grand scale. But the interesting thing though is, while in the UK, we've got 1 or 2 ways to describe snow, because it doesn't happen too often. So you might say, this is deep snow, or this is shit snow. For example, the Sami have around 180 ways of describing snow and ice, because they're around it all the time. But what's really interesting is they have more than 1,000 words for reindeer. And my favourite one is busat, which is a bull with one very large testicle. Amazing. The Sami people are surrounded by snow and reindeer every day, and to a certain extent, their families, their well-being, their livelihoods, and their existence essentially rely on these things. So their behaviour has adapted to the conditions around them, and so has their language. On the flip side, it works the other way as well. So language changes behaviour over time, and there's loads of examples where a change in language will change the way that we as a society or individuals will behave in the world or interact with each other. So you might have seen there's a really, really good talk on TED that came out, I think it was earlier this year, by Stanford linguist Lera Boroditsky and her colleague Berkeley's Alice Gaby, and they talked about some studies that they did onto the language Kuuk-thai, and it's spoken by Aboriginal tribes in northern Australia. And it's a very, very ancient language, but it's got a really interesting fundamental feature, which is that they have no concept of left and right in the language. There is no left and right at all. They work in cardinal directions, as in the points on a compass. So if you needed someone to just nudge to their left slightly, you'd have to work out what direction the sun was, work out what direction they're oriented in, and then ask them to move in that direction. So, I mean, just imagine asking someone at the roundabout to turn south by southwest. It's a really strange concept for us, and yet they naturally will do this, and it changes their behaviours. And they even think of time differently. I find this really interesting because when we're asked in Western culture to list things from older to newer, we tend to do it based around ourselves. It's a very egocentric thing. We kind of go, well, this is older, and things move this way, and this is newer. That's how you would lay out photographs, for example, on a table in front of you. If you ask someone who talks Kuuk-thai to do that, they will always lay those things from west to east, or from east to west, because that is the direction of the sun. But that also means if they're facing a different direction, time might move towards them or away from them. So everything around their behaviours has changed their language. And there's also plenty of evidence that suggests that the language that we use changes the way we think about things and objects in the world, or our attitudes towards each other. And gendered language in particular affects the way that we think about things. There's some really nice examples of languages like German and Italian, for example, where a German bridge might be Die Brücke, for example, which is a strong and stable structure because it's a masculine object. Whereas in Italian, they would use it in the opposite direction. They would use it as a feminine object. And so actually they're beautiful or they're elegant. And so they actually see fundamentally these objects differently just because the way their language changes the way they see these things. And this is a really interesting, amazing example. So hurricanes obviously have a name. They're always named. So they might be called, there was Hurricane Katrina. I don't know their names. Hurricane Barry, whatever. But what's interesting is you're more likely to die in a hurricane with a female name. The reason you're more likely to die in a hurricane with a female name is because we take them less seriously, which means we don't prepare for them as much as we would do a hurricane with a male name. It's incredible that we are actually less worried about an object because of its gendered nature. But then on the flip side, we still pick words that have a profound effect based on our culture in this country and in countries like America. So typically we have a very difficult time at the moment convincing men that it's okay to talk about their mental health and to open up to each other about their worries, their concerns, recognise symptoms of anxiety and depression in others and that sort of thing. And we have this thing that sort of popped up over the last few years, and we're really talking about now, this toxic masculinity, which we're only starting to really break down over the last few years. And that manifests itself, I think, in words like this one. Have you heard the term bromance? Fucking bromance. I hate the word bromance. I don't like the word because it's endemic of the culture that we've created. We complain that we as men bottle up our feelings, and that's why suicides are 40 to 60% higher in men than they are in women. And yet as soon as a man comes close enough to another man that they can talk about their feelings openly with each other, we alienate them with words like this. I did find that there is an equivalent in women though, which is this. There's no equivalent in women because they don't need it. We choose words to have effects. So not only do the words and phrases, are they based on how we're taught and based on, the way that our cultures are built up over many years, but we're also subtly and subconsciously changing our language to reflect the way that we feel about the things that we're talking about. So, and it's also the reason why we'll choose terms like ending a pregnancy versus killing a fetus, or redistributing wealth versus confiscating earnings, or clean break Brexit and complete and utter shit show. So we use them to reflect our attitudes about things and to manipulate others actually into our way of thinking. And it all comes down to the way that our brains work. Fundamentally, our brains work in a slow way or a fast way, two different ways. System 1 thinking is our very rapid, it's our monkey brain. It's our ancient brain. It's the one that makes very rapid decisions based on biases that are really deeply ingrained inside us, that make us make fight or flight decisions. But they are also the things that construct our attitudes. System 2 is our logical brain. And this is the part where rational thought tends to come from. It's the stuff where you're actually thinking about stuff. If you sit down and really concentrate on something, that's coming from your system 2. And if you can adapt people's core so much that their system 1 changes, considering system 1 is how we create our belief systems, so things like, Trump and Brexit and things like that all come from our system 1 stuff. Actually, you can have fundamental effects by changing those things. A recent study into foreign accented language, for example, showed that people, that explicit attitudes to accented language suggest that we see foreign languages as equal if we have time to consider it. But if we're making very snap decisions about foreign languages, we're heavily biased towards what we know, so we like our own languages, but we're not comfortable when we're saying things in alternate languages. That's our system 1 thinking. It's just that we don't feel comfortable with those things. It reflects our underlying biases when we're having to make snap decisions. It's a really interesting further reading on that if you're interested. And this is where the notion of this unconscious bias comes from. We can rationalise that things are a certain way, and if we actually process thought and everything else, our system 2 kicks in, and we're really thinking about stuff. That's where our rational thought comes from. We can do that. And we can really truly know that we're no different from people of other colours and genders and races and everything else. But our cultures and our experiences and language can affect our unconscious bias that we have towards others regardless. We literally can't help it. You can actually test this. So this is something which I did just before the conference actually, where I had a few people come up actually after the conference and say, "You're really brave to put that up." And I thought, well, you sort of missed the point of what I was trying to say. So these are genuine results from a test that I ran a couple of days before the conference. And it's an IAT, which is by Project Implicit as part of Harvard. And it's an implicit bias test. And you can do them online. And what it does is it asks you to put your fingers on certain keys, and you either choose the left answer or the right answer very, very rapidly. And it just shows you words. And it's about word association. And so it will show you, if you're doing a sort of gendered test, for example, it will show you certain things and you decide whether those words feel inherently male or female. And you go in thinking, well, I clearly, I am I'm an equal partner at home. I do equal amounts of the housework, and I would never consider my other half to be a housewife or anything like that.
More what Laura says.
Yeah, it's more what Laura says. But our implicit bias comes out in these sorts of tests. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what my system 2 rationalises. My system 1 seems to think that I have a slight association for male with career and female with family. I literally can't help it because our society builds us up that way. Words that we choose make a difference. So we can choose better terms when we're giving feedback to people as well. So obviously I run the user story. We're a user experience company. We're all about trying to understand human behaviour and then use the way that people behave as a catalyst for designing systems that work around those natural behaviours. So we start when people join us by training people on how to gain and give good feedback on their work. We understand that we're always trying to learn more about the work that we do, so we frame our design critiques and discussions about what we can learn from other people, and we teach the values of curiosity, modesty, and openness in the work we do. We also know that unless you're specific about the kind of feedback you want, people tend to say, yeah, it's lovely, or I don't like it, but they're not really specific enough. So you have to frame a discussion in the right way to get the feedback you want, and you have to ask the right questions to learn what you need to learn. One of the best digital transformation projects I think I've seen in recent years has been the creation and expansion of gov.uk, which is the UK's government digital service arm. The GDS actually are an incredible, really diverse range of people that are constantly doing particularly user research, but lots and lots of research, lots of new design, developing new features, and services for us to better interact with government. But because they're so diverse and they are constantly testing, researching, they've created a really interesting set of principles for giving and receiving feedback. So I'm not going to go through them all, but I do think they're really, really interesting, and they've actually open sourced all this information, so it's worth going and having a look at how they provide and give feedback. But these are some of the notes for how to give feedback, and they've got sort of more detailed explanations of some of the ways that you can do these things as well. And there's also specific ways of asking for feedback as well. So it's worth having a look. And there's also bigger problems that we might be able to solve with language. So diversity, for example, comes up constantly when we're talking about the tech sector at the moment. Currently, less than 25%, I think it is, of the digital industry is made up of women. And it's been falling constantly since the start of the 90s. And I think in part that's due to the language of the web, which since that time has been masculine or even at times quite aggressive. You know, we don't just ask people to write code, we ask people to crush code. Startup culture in particular is really heavily geared towards aggressive and often quite violent language. And it's also creeping into our more common lexicon to describe a feeling of victory or winning something or generally just doing quite well. And it's meant to encourage and inspire, but is it right that we use them to describe something that essentially excludes women when we know that women don't respond well to this kind of language as more inclusive, team-driven language or collaboration-focused language? We don't hear this language in other fields like law or medicine, although since the conference people have come to me and talked about law in particular, and apparently law is quite similar. They actually have a lot of these sorts of terms that they use as well. But I mean, in the tech sector in particular, it's all over the tech sector like a rash. So are these really the terms we want to be using to promote and encourage and inspire people into the industry, or even those that are there already? You might even call me a snowflake for raising this point, but if you did, you'd sort of be proving my point, wouldn't you? So put it this way, I read the other day that a woman on Twitter had decided to break into the web development industry. And I think that sentence in itself says far more about the industry than it does about her. I think if we're putting up enough barriers that someone has to break into an industry, then we're probably doing something wrong. So back to my original question, should we call a group of people guys? So this is a handy chart that I found online, which you won't be able to read, but I'm sure I can send it to you if you're interested. But it essentially goes through a load of different steps to work out what you should call a collective group of people. So there's questions like, do you want to sound casual? Yes. Do you identify as male? No, etc. And there's some really good examples here of, like, you know, you've got women, gals, ladies, lady dudes is probably my favourite. So after thinking about this question about guys and whether we should use the word guys, I've come to the conclusion that no, we probably shouldn't use it. And I'm trying not to. And I know that we can rationalise that guys doesn't really mean the word blokes or fellas or dudes or whatever. But deep down, my implicit bias, and perhaps your implicit bias, does think that that is what it means. If we're going to be more inclusive in the way that we speak to each other and encourage a wider range of perspectives into our teams, then we have to be really mindful about our unconscious biases and use our language to change our attitudes over a longer period of time. It's going to take a long time, and I'm at the beginning of this journey, but I'm hoping that perhaps we can start a discussion and you can come with me too. And that's me. Thank you, guys. Hello.
As a straight white male,
Yes.
can you please tell me about all the guys you've dated?
And this is a wonderful example of where the word guys actually takes on a very different meaning. There's a brilliant tweet from a woman who said, when people say they think that the term guys is a collective term, I ask them how many guys they've dated, and all of a sudden it's a problem to use the term. So yeah, it's an interesting point.
So firstly, thank you for mentioning the conference 3 times at least.
That's all right.
Much appreciated. Secondly, do you really think that bromance has serious negative connotations?
So again, system 2 thinking no, system 1 thinking yes, because I think that bromance, whenever I've heard the term bromance, it's generally almost derogatory. So it's because two men have become quite close and they've got a bit of a bromance going on. And it's seen as quite unusual rather than just being friends. Friend is kind of a nice term. It's been around for decades. We're all quite used to it. And women are allowed to have friends or even girlfriends. If you were to say, me and my boyfriend are going down to the pub, that would sound really strange, and that's sort of the problem. Do you see what I mean? As soon as you're using a new term, unless that term has clearly come from a good space, it feels like it's excluding, and I think that's sort of the problem. Actually, we should be changing attitude.